Welcome to Unsolicited Book Reviews. Today I'm joined by my friend and fellow author Bronson Lemer, who is the author of Last Deployment and Lonely Veteran's Guide to Companionship, which just came out in April. I got to go see him do an event at Makers and Quinn, which was a lot of fun. His other work has appeared in Guernica, Creative Nonfiction, Southeast Review, 20-something essays by 20-something writers, and other places. A 2019 McKnight Writing Fellow. He lives in St. Paul, also teaches at University of Minnesota Rochester, and as far as I'm concerned, is just an all-around super interesting, funny, awesome guy. So welcome, Bronson. Did I miss
Yeah,
anything there?
no. Thank you so much, Michael. That's great. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Yeah, it's always kind of, I don't know. It's a little awkward sometimes when you're introducing a friend. It's like, I don't know, like we go back a ways to graduate school but you've also like led this really interesting professional career as well. So I definitely want to give you props and highlight those. So,
Thank you.
uh,
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I did a reading with a good friend for the book down in Rochester, and it was like the bookstore owner asked us to introduce each other, and I wasn't prepared for that. And I'm like, well, I mean, we're friends. We used to teach together, and she's a wonderful writer, and she's written these books. But I was like drawing a blank. I was like caught off guard, like ah. But yeah, it is a little tricky sometimes when you're doing stuff with friends. You're like, well, what do I say?
for sure. Well, of all the books Bronson could have chosen, he selected this one, The Evening Crowd at Kirmser's, I guess, by Richard J. Brown. And if I had to sum it up, like I was trying to think, I always think about like how you sell these books or how you talk about them. And I guess like succinctly, it's about a gay man living in St. Paul who has been discharged from the Navy as an undesirable. And it's set between 45 and 46.
Yep.
And it's not like the traditional, straightforward, chronological memoir. It's like 13 vignettes, which are
Yep.
all interconnected, but they kind of jump around a bit. And God, it touches on so many things. It's like, passing as straight, code switching, relationships, employment, just the dangers of being fired without cause, based on suspicion, police harassment, which all sounds serious, but there's also like humor in there as well, which is kind of an amazing
hmm
trick to pull off. But
hmm
um, but I'm first two questions for you are essentially how did this book come? How did you become aware of this book? And then why this book of any of the others you could have chosen?
Yeah, good questions. Strangely, I was not aware of this book, which is strange because it is absolutely in my wheelhouse. It's like right at the intersection of things I'm super interested in. So a lot of what I write about is the intersection of sexuality and the military. It's a lot of, both of my books now have been about that in some way, shape, or form. And this book is very much about that as well, right? Someone who is discharged from the Navy when he's 18 in 1945, comes home, and basically, is trying to sort of like figure stuff out, still very young. So, coming of age stories, super interesting to me. Memoirs, super interesting to me. Stuff that has a little bit of history, but is also a very much a personal story and narrative, which I just love. And then, like I said, at the intersection of military and sexuality, which again, right in my wheelhouse. So weirdly, yeah, weirdly, this book was not on my radar, and I had not heard of it until my husband actually gave it to me as a gift.
Oh,
And
wow.
I think he just, again, recognized the types of stuff that I like to read, which again are, memoir, coming of age stories. And he's like, I think you'll like this, and he was right. That's how it kind of came to me, and that was last year, late last year, and then I read it, early this year. Um, and then when I was thinking about, having this conversation and talking to you, Michael, about like what book I wanted to talk about, I wanted to talk about something that I'd recently read, because I wanted it to still be kind of somewhat at least fresh in my mind. Something that, looking back at the books I read this year, a book that spoke to me in some way that I was like, once I got to the end of it, I was like, I want to like talk to someone about this. And
Yeah,
and so this is
definitely.
a perfect situation to be like, oh, you want to like talk about a book? Let's talk about this one because it was something that I just want to talk to someone about. And I also really wanted to highlight, being an author of books that are from smaller presses. I wanted to highlight stories that maybe aren't as mainstream as other stories. And so I wanted to choose something that was a little bit, not from a major publisher, something that was from a smaller press that really deserved, I think, even more kind of, acknowledgement and sort of like, so more people can find out about those stories.
Well, God, I'm so glad you did because it was really interesting. And I mean, this honestly, this is my favorite thing about doing this at all is getting to be exposed to books I wouldn't have come across otherwise. And
Yeah.
this one, weirdly, I mean, we've kind of talked about some of the research I'm doing as well, like fits into that world as well. So, I mean, I really appreciated this glimpse into, I mean, part of the timeline, like when we think
Yeah.
about like, um, just like the different kind of gender rights and a lot of it points to like Stonewall as like a beginning point.
Hmm.
And so like for me, I'm always fascinated by like what came before that,
Hmm.
and this definitely came before that. And I hadn't read anything like that. So um and I also had like kudos to your husband. Like it's hard sometimes to pin down a book that will
Yeah.
work for somebody who reads and is like well versed in the literature.
Yeah.
That's hard to find sometimes. It's a bit of a risk. You never know if it's going to be a good gift or not. So,
Yeah, yeah. It was a perfect it was a great shot at something that again was exactly kind of the kind of thing that he knew I would enjoy. And so yeah, that does take a bit of a skill to
yeah,
to figure that out and pinpoint that. I also just say really quick, like you brought up Stonewall, and I think that's also a great point because the book itself on the back, the back copy does bring up Stonewall. And again, one of the selling points is like oftentimes when we talk about these types of stories, people think of Stonewall as the starting point. And here there are stories that were before Stonewall, obviously. And
yeah,
so, I think it is a really good, interesting selling point of here's a specific story in a specific time that came before this sort of like really big st- point in history that people kind of really think is the start, right? So, yeah, I think
yeah.
that's another reason why I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and well, I mean, we'll get to the book too, but like also just thinking about St. Paul as being the setting for this story, it's not something that I mean, when I think about gay rights and the world that people were living in at that time, like I think of Los Angeles, I think of New York, I
Hmm.
don't think of St. Paul, and yet, when I then kind of checked the history, right? Like 1993, Minnesota becomes the first state to really recognize protections against same-sex couples, and I was just like, wow, I had no idea. And obviously, this is well before that.
Yeah.
So like, however difficult Ricardo's world is in St. Paul in 45, I could only imagine what it would have been like in other states as well.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. We don't think of the sort of, gay rights movement or sort of the sort of like some of these pivotal sort of things happening in some of these smaller cities like St. Paul. So yeah, I think I live in St. Paul, and so I like to sort of, again, another reason I wanted to choose it is highlighting some history from a city that I live in, that I love, that I, really want to recognize and really want to sort of highlight some of the ways that it was, I don't know if progressive is the right word, but at least sort of, the sort of environment for queer people that did exist in St. Paul as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'm always interested in process. So like I love that there's a prologue or foreword to this that kind of sets up like how this book came to be. Because from my understanding, Ricardo was essentially keeping journals and writing things through the time period, but it's not until the 90s that he decides I'm going to try to put this together for publication. And unfortunately passes in 99, but an editor picks up the pieces and then puts the book out in 2001. um and I just think about like, I don't know, so many people don't realize how important mundane things, like just your, I don't know, I as somebody who likes to dig into the archives and the history and things like that, it's so rare to find just accounts of life.
Yeah.
Like how much was a gallon of milk? Like what bars existed where. And when he talks about like going to Mickey's diner and getting food poisoning, I'm like, oh my God,
Right.
that's still there. I've been there before. Like it's so refreshing to have like this record that you can go back to. And I think about like I don't know, his kind of bravery to expose, to tell that story.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was wondering if you had any kind of thoughts about that.
Yeah, yeah, I recognize that as well. I mean, in the book, there's a middle section that has some photographs, and there's a photograph of him near the end of his life that talks a little bit about basically the caption to the photograph is hard at work on the manuscript,
Yeah.
1994, right? So he's working on it, in the 90s. Um, yeah, yeah, I think, I think the historical element and sort of recognizing some of the places is also kind of, again, a really interesting thing for readers. And again, people who know St. Paul or live in St. Paul or have a fondness for St. Paul will recognize places that are in the book, which I think he talks a little bit about. I mean, I loved sort of looking up, where Kirmser's was, right? It's no longer there. The sort of the block was torn down. It's currently the Ecolab's corporate center.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
it's right there. And there's actually a write-up online where someone, basically talks about Ecolab's corporate center now occupies where the bar used to be. And they have this line, and I wrote it down. It's like, office workers now lunch outdoors at the site of Brown's one-time refuge, right? So this is kind of like weird connection to, because the bar itself was like a working man's bar, and it would have lunch, and sort of the people who would take their lunch, sort of working class people would take their lunch at the bar. And so, in the early part of the book, he talks a little bit about this sort of like class component that's a part of this as well, right? And uh, but again, yeah, it mentions sort of different places. One of the things that I, loved again was, being someone from St. Paul and really appreciating learning about some of the history was he also has a part about Little Italy, which there's sort of like the levee and the sort of across from the High Bridge, down kind of where they constructed a road and how they demolished Little Italy essentially to put in a road that runs along the river there. But again, different places I think are highlighted throughout this, and I think is a really nice sort of way for him to sort of call back and recognize all these different parts of history that may have been lost in one way or another, but maybe in the archive somewhere, but at least sort of bringing them out and sort of highlighting how they were a part of his everyday, which I think is great.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned the working class one and the snooty place is the Viking room. He's like,
Right.
"Oh, we couldn't afford that one. Like we couldn't go there."
Yeah,
And,
we're not going to go over to Minneapolis into the Viking room where all the and also too he also talks about the sort of the snooty gays, right?
yeah,
Like
exactly.
it's a whole different crowd in Minneapolis, whereas in St. Paul it's like the sort of like working class gay culture, which again I love the sort of like class distinctions in that way, and especially class distinctions within sort of subcultures like the queer sort of like population and subculture itself. So,
Well, and I found it fascinating that Kirmser's is a German bar. Like it's run by
mhm,
two a German couple, and they, are. I mean, the bar is definitely a character. I know people talk about like, location or whatever, but like it is a character in every one of the stories. And even if it's not set there, there's usually a reference back to, I saw
mhm.
so and so at Kirmshare's once upon a time, or like even when he's down in Red Wing, he runs into somebody that reminds him of, somebody that he saw at the bar. And it's just weird to think of like this husband-wife German couple right after World War II being the people who at least are willing to take the money and but also alert them. I mean, they have a whistle that they alert them like, hey, the police are coming, or
Right.
be on the
Yep.
lookout. And so there's a camaraderie, maybe born purely out of selfishness. I don't know exactly. But that was a really striking part to me, was thinking about who owns that space. And I wanted to know who owned the Viking room then. Like
Yeah.
what's that dynamic like? But
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I found that interesting too, the owners of the bar itself and the sort of again, the sort of like the way it becomes, to me it speaks to the way certain places, especially within queer culture, become sort of refuges for people to be themselves or to sort of like, f find like-minded people, right? Sort of not have to sort of like hide who they really are. And I think, he talks a little bit about in the like one of the later chapters about I think it's a chapter on the Winter Carnival, where he talks about that men just didn't show affection to one another, not even in Kirmser's, not during the Winter Carnival, when it seemed like,
No.
people were sort of like just being super affectionate, and there's a whole history there as well. Appropriately and inappropriately being affectionate with each other. But I think, he talks about even at the bar, they would never, there would be never sort of any kissing, no real affection between men at the bar. So, to an extent, I think people sort of finding the bar as a place they could sort of be themselves and sort of feel comfortable in, at least somewhat comfortable in, I think really spoke to sort of a queer culture, and also the idea that other people knew about this bar. Like it wasn't specifically a gay bar. It's not like it
Yeah.
advertised itself as a gay bar, but everyone with not everyone, but a lot of people within the sort of queer culture in the Twin Cities and beyond knew it as that, right? They would come to Kirmsers because they knew it was a place where the queer community could sort of get together, right? So I think that speaks to a lot of the way it's sort of told, and the way he sort of mentions that, or continually mentions the bar itself, even when he's not, the scene isn't necessarily set in the bar. Again, speaks to a lot of that culture. And again, I can imagine being very similar in the 1940s, that sort of same like word of mouth kind of culture of the places that you can go to feel like you're around like-minded people.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine the difficulty of that. I mean, the book is so riddled with trying to figure out who is safe, what is safe, how you can how you can be nondescript, like even
Yeah,
down to the cigarettes. Like the guy who points out like Chesterfields are feminine. Here's a Camel for you, boy. And it's like, oh my God, like just to think of like the layers of costuming almost
yeah,
that you have to do and performance, to protect themselves in these
yep.
situations, even in places that they thought were safe. It just is. I don't know. I like to think we've come a long ways, but I feel like there's still a lot of room to go, of course. So,
Hmm.
um, but oh shoot, you said something. Oh, I was finding myself just thinking about the different. I was surprised to see gender switching or code switching kind of talked about in there,
Yeah,
because I think of that as a very modern kind of thing. And it was interesting. I mean, between beyond the cigarettes and things like that, thinking of like having awareness of something they didn't necessarily care about, like sports, for instance. In
right.
in his specific instance, just reading the scores so that you could have that conversation and those kind of things. It just, I don't know. I mean, these are the things that, honestly, as a straight person, I didn't think about
Yeah,
until
yeah,
people like, told me about it. And then reading this, going like, God, this goes back so far. And I have to think the further back it goes, even the more difficult it is and the
yeah.
more coded that is. But
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Like some of these ideas around code switching, which again was maybe a very more sort of modern idea that people sort of identified and sort of named, have been something that has been part of the queer culture for a long time, right? And in different ways, and the way it sort of comes up. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting. The level of detail in some of that is super interesting as well. And yeah, again, appreciate his sort of like use of journal, and sort of the way he sort of pulled that from the journal and was able to sort of highlight that as well. I think to speak to the what it was like at the bar and being part of that group and that culture.
yeah, and I think about that process too, right? Like
Right.
I don't know how old he was in 94, I guess. I didn't do the math, but he was 18 and 45, so I should be able to do math. I can't do it on the spot fast enough. But he had the benefit of time and maturity then
Right.
as a grown aging person to look back and go, oh, you know, through my youthful lens said this, and now I can kind of inform it better or contextualize a little bit better and kind of make sense of some of these things in a way that maybe like I would love to see the little sketchy pieces. What did it actually
Yeah.
look like in 45? What was he actually writing down? And then obviously memory changes and distorts with time, but that level of detail is so incredible that I can't imagine that being recreated afterwards. He had to have taken really good notes.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think so. And I think it's really tricky to do too, as I think about someone who, I do something similar in a lot of my work is working from notes, right? I think, at least my first book and this sort of current book I'm working on are both taken from journal entries at the time, and sort of being able to capture that sort of like, I don't know, like that mood vibe, sort of like feeling of the time, but from a sort of distant perspective, right? Because now you're sort of looking back on it and sort of I want to be able to sort of capture kind of that older kind of reflection component as well, but I do want to sort of accurately reflect what I was thinking and feeling at the time as well. And I think, like I said, I think that's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah. I think he does a good, I mean, it comes across as like if he didn't tell me, I would be like, oh, this was a found document.
Yeah,
Like I remember in graduate school reading James Boswell's correspondence, which I mean, he was just a rich guy who wrote letters. And he did not have any intention of publishing them, but
yeah,
he kept all his letters or carbon copies of them or duplicates or whatever. They had all kinds of weird stuff back then. And like it is amazing just to be able to look at like what the conversation was like in 1750. What were they talking about? And in that situation, I struggle with things like he didn't intend to publish this. Like these were
right,
private correspondences, and
right.
the people that he was writing to didn't authorize or say, yeah, yeah, that's okay either. Like they were even less of a consideration. Yet, like as historians, as people of interest in literature, like we go, yes, we need these documents. At least in Ricardo Brown's case, he said, yes, I want this out in the world, and he was working to publish that. But
Yes. Yep.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. Yeah, I think it is, right? Because yeah, it's one thing to sort of I mean, and this recently came up with Joan Didion, right? Because I think
oh
there's a
yeah,
new book of Joan Didion, and again, I haven't dived deep into it, but again, being a fan of Joan Didion and her work the books that she wrote, versus this new book, which is a collection of some of her correspondence, which again, some of the headlines on some of the news things have been, well, would she have wanted us to read this, right? Or was this meant to be read as a larger public, right? And I think we can kind of figure out the answer to that or what's being implied with that. But I think that's a good point, right? Like we construct the story. I mean, and Brown constructed the story that he wanted to tell with this book itself, and I feel to the most part, right? We don't know to what extent it was sort of edited after he passed, right? But I think that's a good thing to think about, right? Who is this intended for, right? Who is intended to read this, if anyone, right? Beyond, especially when we're talking about letters and sort of things like that. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it makes me wonder. Then, I mean, there makes me wonder about a number of things. One is like, is there a book from World War I? And there
Yeah.
probably is, but I don't know what that book is. And then the number of people who, passed and their family looked at documents and discarded them.
Right.
Just it is so rare to hold on to those things and recognize the value. But, in this case, he lived a long enough life to be able to go like, yes, these are things that I should share. And
Yeah.
I'm definitely glad he did. So, um, I don't, did you have a favorite vignette? I guess maybe that's another way to talk directly about the book.
Yeah, I mean, I like sort of you're talking about them as vignettes, and I guess they are. I think about them that way. It reminds me so much of I mean, in constructing my own memoir, um, I did think of them as sort of like little vignettes because it was easier for me to put it together as a whole to think of
Sure.
them that way. And I guess, I can see that quite a bit here. It definitely sort of spans a certain time period in this book, right? But I think they are sort of like little separate moments that do sort of speak to a larger whole. I really liked the vignette or chapter on the Winter Carnival, which again I think was just again is something that takes place in Minnesota still to this day. So he's writing about the 1946 Winter Carnival. I liked it because again it's an event that has a lot of history in St. Paul. It's an event that was actually extra special in 1946 because it was right after the war. And so there was an extra sort of celebratory thing that was attached to it.
Sure.
I liked that, like it was part of it really highlighted kind of the bar at its sort of like peak or lively, the most lively kind of aspect of the bar, right? Was during the Winter Carnival because people would come from out of town to the Winter Carnival. And so it felt like this very sort of like bustling kind of place. And it was kind of like the key, kind of like, if you want to see this sort of bar at its sort of like prime, here's a kind of an example of what it was, maybe. Um, and I like those so I liked a lot of those aspects that he was kind of working with there. And as I mentioned earlier, the part where he talks about sort of showing affection, that comes up in that chapter, that vignette as well. So I think it kind of encapsulates a lot of what I see as some of the sort of like themes and different things and different characters, the different sort of situations, all kind of come up in that sort of like vignette itself. And I love that.
I have to admit to never going to the Winter Carnival. So like, I mean, his description of it kind of matches like my expectation, I guess. But like, what is it like today? I mean, is it something you've gone to?
Well, I can't speak to it too much because, like I said, I'm not someone who sort of attends it every year. Just being aware of it, though, as a sort of an event. I like some of the lore behind it. Some of the he talks about in the book. He talks about the Vulcans, which are these in 1946 were war veterans who it's almost like this. Um, I think it is an actual society now, but it's almost like a kind of got a secret society kind of vibe to it. They would ride around in this fire truck. They would sort of hop off the truck and they would like go up to women and basically like kiss them and then mark them on the forehead. And I know this has changed obviously because there's a lot of issues with consent
Right. Yeah.
about related to that. So this has very much changed, but I know it is something that if you look it up, as I did online, you can find Reddit posts where people are talking a little bit about their experience of the Winter Carnival when they were kids, and what it's like now, and some of these different things. So the lore of sort of like they're supposed to represent the end of winter, right? And so it's supposed to be this big sort of carnival that's not only celebrating winter, but also celebrating kind of this sort of like shift and move into spring, which for people in Minnesota and St. Paul, we all know
A big difference. Yeah.
why that's why that's a thing to celebrate, right?
For sure.
Especially, when we used to have these really brutal winters, right? So yeah, I can't speak too much about that, but I did sort of dive in a little bit because again, I wanted to sort of like better understand some of the sort of like lore that's surrounding the carnival itself, which again I found super interesting.
Yeah, to get kind of nerdy, I remember one of the graduate classes I took was on Bakhtin, and his carnival was his
Mm,
big thing, right? And the
mhm.
idea of the carnival was a mixing and mingling of people of all classes and all races, and everybody just together on kind of an equal playing field for a short term time. And
Yeah.
you definitely get that celebration in here where it does feel like the guard is down. People aren't looking over their shoulders nearly as much as they once were. There are fewer judgments maybe going around because maybe because everybody's inebriated and doing their own thing, but also like,
Yeah.
it feels like a moment of kind of freedom, which is, I'm sure, unique and, yeah, hard for him. But
Yeah, it feels like that's happening in this chapter too, in this vignette, because I think maybe he was very much influenced by that idea as well, but maybe that's just really what it sort of felt like in the bar at that time,
yeah,
right? That sort of like leveling of like, hey, but also I think, being 1946 and the sort of relief from the war and being over and some of that stuff, I think may have been a play as well. But again, super interesting to think about it, what that sort of environment was like. And I think he does a great job of sort of showing us that in that chapter.
yeah. I my favorite. I was trying to find when you were talking. I was trying to flip through and remember what chapter it was. It's definitely one of the latter ones. I want to say it was maybe number 12, which is like the picture, the
The
something.
picture window, yeah.
Yeah, and stories like that in general, where he talks about seeing somebody in a completely new context. You know, he has some sexual experiences throughout the book, and some of them are with people who go on to live straight lives or whatever. And so there's this constant moment of like different contextualization that happens,
Mhm.
that was really interesting to me, and like see, um, I don't know, how do I kind of process that? You know, like, how do I feel about this? And, you know, is this person living an authentic life? Was that like, I don't know, how do I fit into their life? And, you know,
Yeah.
like I can only imagine that kind of jarring nature as well. So those stories kind of stuck out to me. And there are moments in other ones, but that's the one that's kind of extended because, um, I don't
Yeah,
know.
no, I love that. I love that. And I will second that because that's another one I was going to bring up because that one again is really struck me as like, here's a photograph of someone I knew at one point in my life and sort of like here's a way for me. I think he uses it as a way to tell some more of that sort of specific connection and that sort of time in his life and how he was thinking about how others viewed him and how he viewed others and sort of how that's sort of now he's thinking about that in maybe a different way. And I forget if that's the chapter where he brings up um, coming back to St. Paul after being away for so many years, and he goes to visit his aunt, I believe, and
Yeah.
the aunt has a like news clipping of the Dickie Grant, one of the
Yeah.
characters, who was stabbed to death in prison, and he sort of just really sort of takes that in and is very sort of emotional about sort of the impact of what happened to this guy he used to know from the bar, years later, seeing that sort of like, clip about how he died, and how that impacted him. It may have been a different chapter, but again, that was another kind of like small snippet from one of the chapters that I thought was really well done as a way to sort of like talk about it's again connected to the bar because it's someone he knew from the
Right.
bar, but it's happening years later. I think the bar is even gone at that point, and he's sort of looking back on his connection to this person.
Yeah. I wondered about that and how, like, when that one was written, like that one felt, especially that moment of reflection, felt so crafted. Like, I
Yeah,
mean, it felt really well done. Like, that was one of the ones I was like, okay, this felt like this was, you know, a late addition to the collection.
right,
Maybe upon reflection of, you know, maybe that was even the spark that generated putting the rest of it together. You
right.
know, the like, I had this moment, oh, it makes me remember all these other things. And I have writing. Like, I could, if you told me that story, I would believe that as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, think about it from the construction standpoint of how he put these together and sort of ones that I mean, because I can definitely sort of identify that in my books and the sort of the stories that came up more naturally and the ones that took longer to either process. I imagine, this could have been one that did come later because it took longer for him to process it and figure it out, which I can relate to that as an experience as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting when I think about like and I can't help but think about it as a collection, you know, and whether it's a short
Yeah.
story collection or a collection of essays or vignettes, like I always think about the ordering and how fraught that is, right? Like they're not, you don't necessarily want to put them out in the order that you wrote them.
Right.
But there should be some kind of flow or vibe to it. And, you know, it starts with really an introduction to Kirmser's. God, I struggle with that name. I don't know. It just
I
doesn't
do.
roll off my tongue.
I do as well. It's the same. I kept going like, because I want to call it Cursomers or
Yeah, I know.
something, something slightly different, but it's not. And there's something a little bit, yeah, difficult with the way it's said.
Yeah. But you start off with that introduction of the bar, which really kind of sets the tone. I mean, I couldn't imagine it starting with any other piece
Yeah.
in the book for that reason. But you know, then some characters get their own chapter. Like there's a whole chapter about Lucky, and there's really a whole chapter about the Flaming Youth. Although I
Mhm.
don't think it's called the Flaming Youth. He gets his own chapter though.
Yep. I think it
And
is actually called Flaming
is
Youth,
it
actually.
okay?
Yep.
I must have. All right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's number 10. Okay. Sorry. I thought it was earlier, which is why I was like, I missed it when I looked at the table of contents. Um, and then like the girls collectively all kind of get their own chapter
Hmm.
combined. And I found myself wondering, like I kind of wanted some of the other characters maybe to get moments to shine a bit more. And you definitely get a lot of Ricardo Brown, but because he's the storyteller, you don't often get his personal background.
Yeah.
There were moments where I was like, I wish there was more of an extended version of his childhood or something
Right.
instead of it being broken up among all these things. And I guess I'm just wondering, since you literally write similarly, do you ever find yourself avoiding some of those things that feel tropish or too commonplace, or maybe too
Yeah.
revealing that you're not willing to talk about that? Or
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying, and I do kind of I recognize that as well. I kind of maybe, and maybe this is again why I have a sort of fondness for the book itself, is I recognize the sort of voyeuristic, sort of like fly on the wall nature of the storytelling in here.
sure,
I think there are actually a lot of personal details shared in the book throughout, right? Throughout
yeah,
in different parts, but also it's very much like I'm the youngest one. He talks about being like the youngest person at the bar. He was 18,
yeah,
right? So he's the youngest person. I think Dickie Grant was a couple years older than him. And so he's like the youngest one. So he's almost the best in some ways way to be like he's already maybe probably already feeling a little bit like an outside, a little bit like an outsider, or a little bit like a fly on the wall, right? But he's at this sort of like really sort of pivotal point where he's sort of capturing and taking it all in because he's at this sort of like moment of just sort of like, maturing or figuring stuff out. And so I think he's at this sort of perfect point to serve as the sort of narrator fly on the wall. But again, in doing so, it's very much like he's very much telling the story of other people, right? And so, and part of that, I mean, I connect to some of it in the sense that I think that's a sort of like important sort of thing that some people do as a way to protect their own kind of their own stuff sometimes, right? As a
sure,
way to say like I'm not going to be vulnerable, or I'm going to kind of hold on to this stuff, and as a way to sort of like pivot is I'm going to pivot to all the other things that are going on around me, right?
yeah. And
I think he does both, but I think there is some of some of both of those things as well.
I think your comment early on about it being a coming of age story, weirdly, I didn't think about that, but it
Mm.
really is. I mean, it
Yeah,
really is, like you said. I mean, he's the youngest. He's being, he's had moments of discovery on his own, but then also like this is really an introduction to here is this culture in St. Paul, and in fact, he's one of the people who doesn't know about the bar. He's like, oh, I've walked past this before and I didn't even know it was here, and so you have those kind of moments. So it does make sense as your kind of guide, I guess, for the book.
yeah,
And like you said, like fly on the wall, kind of voyeuristic kind of perspective of reporting almost like, here are these people, this is what's happening. As I imagine he's taking it in and processing and figuring out, like, where do I fit in this as well? Um, but
yeah. Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, he goes on to be like a newspaper reporter, and so it makes absolute sense, like the sort of like the things that he's good
yes,
at, right, which are sort of telling the story of this sort of like this place and the people within this place, right? And I think, again, I relate to that. I started in journalism myself and sort of did a little bit of like newspaper stuff early on, and again, when I talk about my own process, it's especially when I talk about like writing about place in particular, a lot of that came from my journalism background, like because that's what you're kind of like trained to do. You're trained to be that sort of fly on the wall, and here's the sort of place and the people around me, and here's kind of everything about that, but not about me, right? So,
sure,
um, and I think one of the other things is I really enjoy stories where someone is it is very much has a sort of like journalistic feel, but it's very much bridging into the personal as well, right? It's sort of the memoirs or personal essays that sort of do both of these things. They're very vivid in their description of a place or people and situations, but they're also at times very personal and very vulnerable. And I love that because again, I think it's sort of like, a lot of different journalists have done that and have sort of pushed that sort of boundary into like what journalism can be. It can be, I think a lot of journalists are trained to not include themselves, but so many of them, this has been going on for a while, include themselves in some of their reporting because again, it provides a whole nother layer to the story and the ideas that they're telling, right? Or the place that they're describing. So,
Well, and I think, yeah, I mean, I always appreciate that. Even thinking, I guess, about the kind of fiction I like
hmm.
fiction that has a strong narrative voice, that is like, I don't know, it has an attitude, it has a persona beyond just an objective
Yeah,
person perspective. And so I love that about this. I mean, you're right. I mean, as much as I wanted to know more about him, and you're right, there's lots of woven into each of the stories there as well. It really did serve a great, just as a great vessel for storytelling.
yeah,
And that is my favorite kind of reporting,
yeah,
where you
yep,
you the maybe you shy away from the I, but you are involved, you're entrenched, you're engaged in this story, that you're reporting about. So yeah, it definitely works that way very well. I hadn't thought about the journalistic aspect, but you're right.
yeah.
I mean, he ends up becoming a reporter, and he leaves, like you said, he leaves the area for a number of years and then comes back. And I think then he works for the Pioneer Press for a time.
Yeah, yeah, he works for Pioneer Press. I think there's a part where there's a photo where it talks about him working for a newspaper in Alaska. I think
Yeah,
when he comes back after when he mentions Dickie Grant and seeing the news clipping about Dickie Grant, he talks about being at a newspaper in Ohio. So, and again, if we know that he wrote this, or put it together, at least in the 90s, sort of like after a lot of these other experiences, right? So it makes sense then that some of that sort of like journalism reporter
sure.
experiences sort of bled into how he was able to tell this story or what influenced him in the way he told this story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. I'm curious, as someone who writes memoir, like, what do you take away from a book like this? Because I don't know about you. I mean, I read books for enjoyment, obviously, but I think it's also hard to turn off the craft part of your brain, like how is this
Yeah.
functioning and blah blah blah, and what can I kind of learn from this thing? Are there things that you picked up on through this that you're like, I don't know, that maybe would be missed by somebody who is less versed in memoir writing or has read fewer memoirs?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think, you know, I think there probably are a few things here that come to mind. I think, like we're talking about the sort of blend with journalism and memoir and sort of the way people talk about place. I think, if you're kind of more used to a sort of a memoir that does have more of a focus on story and sort of like personal reflection, which a lot of them do and a lot of great ones do. I think this one, like we said, very much is interested in a place and the sort of blending of a person who's sort of like coming into their own within a place and surrounded by these people. So I think there are elements here that people can really appreciate. I think I know it's hard to ask anyone to really appreciate like the historical stuff if you're not really kind of invested in like the city or the place that it's from. But I think those are
Sure.
things that could definitely be missed by people who aren't. I think it just adds a greater level of appreciation if you're familiar with the place he's writing about and sort of and again, I think I do appreciate sort of people coming at it with I think some of the cultural components of what that culture and society was like. Um, at that time, the queer community at that time, I think, if you're not sort of familiar with kind of some of that might get a little missed here as well, because it's definitely about that. But if you're, picking up on some of those sort of like finer details of like one of the things I noted was I forget the character who comes up with all the nicknames, but they have a nickname for the three people, the husband and wife, and then the husband's
Oh, yeah.
lover.
Yeah.
The three kind mice, they
Yes, the
call
three
them.
kind mice. That's
And
right.
so it's this way of talking about, it's this super interesting kind of part where they're talking about how their presence was so disconcerting to them, right? They were uncomfortable with this idea of like a throuple, essentially, like three people,
Yeah.
what it seemed like was a throuple, and how uncomfortable they were when you're thinking about sort of like queer culture and the sort of like way people in queer culture sort of feel like outcasts or sort of feel outside of sort of the norm. then having a sort of view at another sort of like relationship that is also outside of the norm, and also sort of commenting on the way that they thought they were sort of like uncomfortable with that. All right. So again, it's super interesting sort of like thinking about those perceptions and those views within a culture, particularly a culture that has been sort of sidelined or sort of, like viewed in a very specific way. I
Yeah,
found some of that super interesting.
yeah, the Three Kind Mice was a good example. I was really struck by that also, just that idea of people think we are outside the norm, but this is pushing our boundaries of comfort. And I mean, I
Right.
think every group, I can't remember, is it David? I think David Eagleman and other people have used this term too, but he has a podcast that I enjoy, and he always talks about in groups and out groups,
Mm,
just as a collective way of talking about whether it's class or race or gender or whatever, right? And every in and out group has its defining things. Like that is beyond where we would go. We can't
yeah.
do that. And it was refreshing isn't the right word, but it felt very authentic to be like, okay, yes, this is unacceptable to us. We don't understand that. That is something that we struggle with.
Yeah.
And I definitely enjoyed those moments where you figure out kind of, yeah, how you're defining the group, and what they're okay with and what they're not and what's acceptable,
Right.
and who they're willing to include. Even like you said earlier with the distinction between the Viking room and the
Yeah. Yep.
the drinking man's working man's bar, right? Like there's this there's this line there as well, which is just kind of funny. But I enjoyed, like, I was thinking about, as somebody who enjoys history, and I don't know St. Paul and Minneapolis nearly as well as I'm sure you do, but it was really, it felt like it required a fair amount of confidence and familiarity with the area to not offer little additional nuggets. Like Mickey's Diner is mentioned, but it doesn't say like established in 1912, or like
Right.
there's no additional unpacking. Like if you want to figure that out, go find out. If you know, you know. And so it felt like a very real, very confident person who can give this kind of, guide of the city and this introduction to the area. And there are so many details in there for anybody who does know the area a little bit or wants to dig, that can find those things. Like you said, apparently now Ecolab is where Kirshner's was. So,
Yeah, I think it
um,
adds a deeper level. Like I appreciate that he didn't sort of, because I think it would, there are times when I do this as well in my own writing. Like there are times when I, will include things because I feel like the reader needs to sort of know these things in order to understand what I'm talking about. But in doing so, you break up the voice, or you break up the sort of like meaning, or sort of gets in the way of some
yeah,
aspect of the writing, right? And so you leave it out and sort of then ask the reader to take a little extra effort to be like, well, if I want to know kind of where this church was, which I did, I like looked up like a specific church, right?
sure,
Um, I can do that, all right? He's providing, I think, yeah. So I really appreciated that as well. Like I think yeah, again, for readers who are familiar with the area, or readers who want to sort of know more and kind of can dive in, you can find out this information, right? But I think of it very much as a writer's choice at times, right? Or maybe in maybe the writing or the editing process, where you have to sort of be like, well, how much do I want to give here, and how much do I maybe want to like leave out because again, it's getting in the way of certain things, and just rely on my reader to do a little bit of work if they're interested, right?
sure,
It's a balancing act. I think it really is, especially when you're writing like, specific stuff like this, right? And specific stuff like there's a piece I'm working on now that I mentioned, like a nickname I had when I was in the military, which is based off of, and the nickname is based off of my last name. But it's like I really like the flow of how kind of how I have it, right? And adding a little part where I talk about how the nickname is like inspired by my last name, which is French, right? It just feels like it's throwing off like the flow of what I have going on there.
sure.
So I'm like, and I've had people be like, well, why do you have that nickname? Like, we need to know more here. And I'm kind of like, do you though? Like, so again, it's one of those things that I think yeah, it's definitely interesting to think a little bit about audiences and how different audiences will appreciate this in different ways. And again, that's what I think a lot of good books, right, will have something similar. Like different audiences will take away different things and find different things that are important or interesting in them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. So anything else we should say or that I didn't ask that you want to talk about? I
Oh boy, no,
figured
this has
I'd
been
give you the
good.
last word.
No, this has been great. I think, there's so much here, and like I said, that's why I kind of like the book because it works on so many levels. And I think, and just talking to you too, I even picked up on other ways that maybe I wasn't aware of in some of the discussions we've had. So, no, I think this has been great. Has been a great way to talk about all those different things. I think we've covered a lot of the stuff that I kind of like noted or wanted to sort of talk about. So,
Awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, everyone, first of all, evening crowd at Kirschers. There you go.
Kirmsers?
Kirmsers. There you go. Damn it.
I know.
Ricardo J. Brown. I would definitely recommend it. I mean, I found it super interesting. And when I think about selling books, like I could see this on the shelf with yours as well. I mean, it felt like a nice partner that would be hanging out on that shelf with your writing. Do you have any events coming up or anything like that that you want to mention?
Not currently. Am hoping to do some stuff again in the fall, related to the book. So,
Awesome. Well, and if you haven't picked up Bronson's book, The Lonely Veteran's Guide to Companionship, definitely recommend it. It's super interesting as well. Um, Thanks so much for coming today and chatting. Appreciate it.
yeah, thank you so much, Michael, for having me. This has been great.
Thanks for listening. You can find out more about me at my webpage, michaelmacbride.com, or on most social media platforms with the same handle, at Michael McBride. That's MacBride, like Mac and Bride. Let me know what you're listening to, or if you read one of these books, leave me a comment and let me know what you thought. Have a great day.